And I'm delighted to see you here for our pre-concert talk before this wonderful quartet concert called Outside the Shadow of Beethoven. As usual, I am joined by a very good friend, Dr. Laurie Shulman. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you, Gary, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have to tell you, it's always especially fun to do these with Gary on afternoons when he's not performing. He's more relaxed, and he isn't with half his brain back there saying, "Where is my fiddle?" And it's just a lot of fun because he knows this music so intimately. He knows our artists intimately and has a very special personal connection with them that I'd like you to tell us about right now.
This quartet was actually formed and encouraged by my uncle, Joseph Levinson, in the St. Petersburg Conservatory. So in many ways, I am their musical uncle, and I take full credit and full responsibility. But they are a great group. You'll really enjoy their work.
Gary has curated a really beautiful program this afternoon that I hope will be thought-provoking and musically enlightening for all of you. As you see, his title is In the Shadow of Beethoven, and we are starting with Beethoven and concluding with Brahms. There's a Shostakovich work in the middle, which was in its own way deeply influenced by Beethoven as well. Beethoven's shadow looms long for the entire 19th century, obviously through to the 20th century, and I think that most 21st century composers would acknowledge a debt to him as well. The point that I'd like to make before we begin our musical examples is that Beethoven had his own shadows that he had to deal with. As most of you know, he was born in Bonn, the capital of the former East Germany, a relatively small musical center. And before long, the siren song of Vienna was beckoning to him. He was encouraged by a local friend named Stefan von Breuning, whose family were substantially wealthier than the Beethoven family. And they really encouraged Beethoven, including encouraging him to go to Vienna when the opportunity arose. We are looking at one of the rooms that is analogous to the kind of room where some of Beethoven's music would have been performed. But Gary, I'd like you to address the specifics of this hall, which may look quite large in comparison to the auditorium we're in, but it's not so large as it appears.
Yes, it's a question of the picture itself, but what I would like to draw your attention to is the shoebox shape, which has now been almost universally acclaimed as the best way to listen to music. And certainly those of you who are familiar with Vienna, you know not only the Konzerthaus, but also the Musikverein, which is one of the most legendary concert halls. It was built about 1850. So this is really the kind of concert hall and acoustics that Beethoven would have been used to, and the musicians of his time would have been used to perform these works.
And it's where, of course, great performances of his music take place today. So he was drawn to Vienna, but he did not try a string quartet for a good long time after he arrived in Vienna in the early 1790s. And I've enumerated part of this. I'm not going to read this list to you. I don't do that. But I did want you to have a sense of how many different instrumental combinations he had experimented with in chamber music before he attempted either a string quartet or a symphony. Every work you're looking at up on that list was a sketch of sorts. It was a dress rehearsal for his initial foray into the realm of the string quartet. And I think that many of you know that the term WOO, it doesn't mean woo. It stands for the German Werke ohne Opuszahl, work without opus number. Some of these were published in Beethoven's lifetime, many of them were not, but they're important works in his development as a composer, and it's significant that he chose those Opus 1 trios to be his first published work. So with all this experience, why would he's so hesitant to write a string quartet? Well, here are his shadows. You recognize this guy, and you recognize this guy. These were the ones who nurtured the string quartet from its infancy in the late 1750s and early 1760s in Haydn's hands to the masterful works that both Haydn and Mozart composed in the 1780s and, in Haydn's case, well into the 1790s, which is, of course, the period during which Beethoven was coming into his first maturity. So he had a lot of his own shadows chasing behind him. Brahms often observed that you will never know how difficult it is to hear the footsteps of Beethoven treading behind you. Well, Beethoven finally got around to it with his Opus 18, a series of 6 string quartets. We are opening this afternoon's program with the second of that group, and this work has been nicknamed the Compliments Quartet because of its opening gesture, which has been likened to a gentleman paying his respects to a lady most likely asking for her hand for a dance. May we hear example 1, please? So we've got this idea of very formalized bowing, curtsying, structured small talk that was acceptable in polite society, these quick 2-bar phrases, how are you, madame? I'm fine, thank you, sir, and how are you this evening? It's a very orderly building block. And this is the material that Beethoven spins into his first movement. I'm going to play next the transition to his second theme. This is very much cast in the ideals of Mozart's and Haydn's mature string quartet. You will hear a transition, the actual bridge, the first violin's going to move into triplets, and then you have this second theme, and he's immediately giving us a variation on the second theme because Beethoven is always developing. Track 2, please. So the first thing we want to notice here is that there's immediately a variation on that second theme. And the second thing is that in 2 cases in that brief clip, we heard the first violin getting a considerably more elaborate part than the second violin. In these early Beethoven quartets, I would have to say the first violinist is still first among equals, even though in theory all 4 parts are equal.
Absolutely. And I think also one thing is important to remember, in the Haydn quartets and certainly the Mozart quartets, many of these parts were there to be a show-off kind of a gesture, whereas in these Opus 18th, it's really a homogenized version of all 4 instruments. It's never just for fluff.
You get a very good sense of that in the beginning to the Adagio movement, which is a dignified chorale. It's almost reverent. This is track 3, please. We call this kind of writing rhythmic unison. It means that for the most part, all 4 parts are moving with the same rhythm to form these homogeneous harmonies that are so pleasing to the ear. Beethoven does something radical in this movement that, to the best of my knowledge, is unprecedented in the string quartet literature. He interpolates a fast dance into the middle of his adagio, and it comes out of nowhere. Let's hear track 4, please. It's a crazy thing to do. We're in the middle of this reverent chorale, and all of a sudden, we have this German dance that's just been plopped down in the middle of it. What's particularly interesting to me is that this is something he did at least twice that I know of in the late quartets. He returned to this idea again and again, just putting a crazy German peasant dance in the middle of something that is bordering on the sublime.
And also remember that most of his audience would have known the previous quartet, so this would have been a jaw-dropping gesture where they would have said, "What are you doing to us?" And possibly rushed the stage. But this would have been in a salon, so no stage to worry about.
All right, his third movement is a conventional minuet, but it's pushing the boundaries and really almost verging on the pace of the livelier scherzo. This is a bit of a stretch, but if you listen really carefully, it's closely related in its contour, by which I mean the shape of its intervals, to the Adagio theme, but he has changed the key center, he's changed the tempo, and he's changed the rhythm. Let's hear track 5, please. He's clearly picking up the pace after that slow adagio, and he carries it even further in the finale, which is one of the movements that is most indebted to his sometime teacher, Franz Joseph Haydn. Haydn was noted for his wit, particularly in his finales, and Beethoven is clearly trying to plumb the idea of a sense of humor, but he's also pushing the envelope in terms of tempo, and things are almost out of control, but not quite. Let's hear the beginning of the finale, track 6, please. One of the things that's unusual about this is that he gives the opening melody to the cello. He is starting to break from the tradition of letting the first violinist drive the bus, so to speak. And in the passage leading up to the double bar, this is another sonata form movement, he really just takes what we just heard, puts it in fast forward, puts it on steroids, if you will, and turns it into a madcap race. You'll hear that initial motive, bum, 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 and just listen to what he does with it as he's racing towards that double bar. Track 7, please. It's just dizzying what all 4 players are doing at that point, and it really takes enormous precision and skill to coordinate that kind of playing.
One thing I want to draw your attention to is the instruments you're going to see this afternoon, you're going to hear this afternoon. And the instruments you're hearing now in this recording are the modern instruments. These quartets would have been played with gut strings, with a concave bow. So the opening that Laurie referred to in the cello would have been extremely difficult to play because it doesn't respond quickly with gut strings. And fortunately, at least for this audience, I think we're going to have the steel strings, which respond much quicker, and so you get much more excitement out of it.
This also helps to explain why the cello concerto literature took a lot longer to evolve than the violin concerto literature did. All right, moving to Shostakovich now. I think that most of you know that he wrote 15 symphonies and 15 string quartets. The conventional wisdom is that the symphonies were his public statements that were more in keeping with Soviet theory and ideals, and that the string quartets, which he did not begin until much later in his career, I think he'd completed 5 symphonies before he even did the first quartet, and late in life he was writing a lot more quartets and a lot fewer symphonies. The emphasis shifted, if you will. He was closely associated with the Beethoven quartet, not to be confused with Beethoven, or one of Beethoven's quartets, but it was the name of a Russian ensemble that made their career performing the quartets of Beethoven. They premiered all but 2 of Shostakovich's 15 quartets, numbers 2 through 14, including this one. I have a slide of them a little bit later. This is an unusual quartet. You can see from your program it only has 2 movements, and I need to warn you up front, the second movement is something like 20 minutes long. The first movement's 6 or 7 movements long. He's basically telescoping what we would think of as 3 other movements and sort of gluing them
It's more of a stream of consciousness kind of a thing.
Gluing them together. But what is so striking, what everyone comments on about this quartet is that the cello's opening motive, and I would point out that that is something that is clearly indebted to Beethoven, who was a pioneer in that regard, he actually outlines a 12-tone row. This quartet dates from 1968, which is the height of when serialism and dodecaphony were dominating world composition. But Shostakovich never went that direction. You will hear he resolves almost immediately to his home tonality of D-flat major. Track 8, please. So right from the outset, we have this duality between something that is decidedly modernist, and where is our ear trying to anchor us, and something that almost sounds like a technical exercise at the very beginning with the cello in that slow da 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 and the sustained notes in the first violin. He kind of wanders in and out of tonality, and that to me is one of the core things that is going on throughout this quartet. Listen to a little later in the first movement, you'll hear this war between tonality and atonality or modernism in a section that is classic Shostakovich sardonic waltz. Track 9, please. We move now to the second movement because it is the lengthiest and the thorniest movement, I think, on this afternoon's program. One of the keys to it is a motive that will appear right at the outset. It's 4 short notes and 1 long note, which translates to da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. You will hear that over and over again in this quartet, and it helps kind of as signposts along the ways because you'll hear how many different ways that Shostakovich treats this motive. It's classic Beethovenian development, taking a very simple idea and reworking it so that he can make many, many different colors out of something that is small and a tiny little cell. Let's hear the beginning of the second movement. It's kind of an aggressive crying out, but listen for that motive. Track 10, please. I already mentioned that this second movement sort of telescopes the basic concept, what Gary called stream of consciousness, of a conventional 3 movements, but they're all sort of together. This is it's sort of a quasi-scherzo section, but here is a different segment, a couple of minutes in, that emphasizes that same motive, but in a completely different musical fashion. Number 11, please. It's sort of melodic, but it's sort of atonal, and he's at war. He's trying to figure out, how do I remain Dmitri Shostakovich and still function within this Soviet system?
Well, I think it's important to remember the Soviet system. You know, after this, in '68, with the invasion of the Czech Republic and the Czechoslovakia in those days, what you were getting is a lot of the government things that people like Shostakovich would love to rebel against, except that he had a minor problem. It was called the Gulag. So he had to actually put in all kinds of protests that were like code. And in many ways, I think this idée fixe of the 4 short notes and 1 long one is something that the musicians would have gotten, but the Stalinist regime would not have.
My next example is from a section that could pass for a slow movement. The example I've chosen has an extended pizzicato passage for first violin, which is eventually answered by the 3 other strings. It would be too long if I did the entire example with the pizzicato, so I've come in. My clip starts towards the end of the solo, but it is an unusually extended solo for the first violinist, again harking back to the example that traces back to Beethoven and before him to Mozart and to Haydn. Let's listen to track 12, please. To me, this is related spiritually to the crying out that we heard at the beginning of the second movement when we had our first exposure to the da-da-da-da-da motive. My last example is from near the end of the quartet, where we will eventually get positive resolution into the home tonality of D-flat major, but we still have this war of harmonic language. It's hard to figure out exactly where to put down your anchor in terms of what the home key is. You will, however, hear that scherzo motive of the 4 short notes followed by the 1 long one, because it's sort of a leitmotif that travels through the entire movement. Track 13, please. Before we move on to Brahms, I just want to point out to you again that the Beethoven Quartet, which was arguably the most celebrated mid-century string quartet in the Soviet Union, were close friends of Shostakovich's. He worked very closely with them. He understood their sound. They understood what he wanted from them as players, and it was an extremely fruitful, mutually beneficial relationship for all of them musically.
Take a look at this picture. It's kind of unique because they're smiling in it. You know, that's a huge...
Smiles are relative in the USSR.
So Soviet smiles for the camera would have been very unusual. I have a feeling this was a fantastic performance where everybody was happy.
Yes, and they clearly look dressed for a performance. That's not a rehearsal. That's not a rehearsal picture.
No.
All right, but again, the shadow of Beethoven very clearly lay over Shostakovich, and I think that few would contest that he and Bartók were the greatest composers of string quartets in the 20th century. So, and you'll notice who the bust of is in Shostakovich's studio. We have a bust of Ludwig van Beethoven up there as daily inspiration for him. All right, we move on now to Brahms, everyone's favorite composer, right? Maybe not everyone's. I went through a phase in college when Tchaikovsky was my favorite composer, but by the time I hit my 18th birthday, I think I had graduated from that. I still love Tchaikovsky, but he is no longer my favorite composer. For me, Brahms plumbs emotional depths and gives both the performers and the listeners a degree of spiritual satisfaction that is rare in great music and continues to give back to one again and again. But here's the conundrum. Brahms had that same shadow of Beethoven that lay over him, and he articulated it in his reluctance to produce a symphony, which took him even longer than a string quartet did. But he, too, hesitated to produce a string quartet, and there were 2 reasons. One was the shadow of Beethoven, and he had Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart before him, along with his elder colleague, Robert Schumann, and his younger colleague, Mendelssohn died when Brahms was still a teenager, but he certainly knew their works. He knew Schubert's works. He knew that he had big shoes to fill. But the other reason that Brahms waited so long to write a string quartet, his Opus 51, is that Brahms was a pianist and his chamber music worked best when he had piano involved in some capacity. So, Gary, why wasn't he comfortable in this idiom?
Well, unlike Beethoven, who played the violin, unlike Mozart, who played the violin, Brahms was always a pianist. He was discovered by Schumann as a pianist. And I dare say most of his string writing took place after he was befriended by Joseph Joachim, the great Hungarian violinist. So he learned a lot about the string instruments quite late. Also, very important to remember that he was an unbelievable editor. Some people, you would speak better to this, but some people believe that he destroyed over 400 of his own works. And we have no idea of what they were, except to try to trust that what is left is the best of what he didn't destroy. So I think it's one of those things you got to know that he was very difficult and tough on himself with what was going to be published.
Another parallel with Beethoven is that he and Beethoven both came from central North German cities, and the siren call of Vienna was very, very strong. Brahms initially went there in the early 1860s, went back to northern Germany, and eventually came back and settled permanently in Vienna, and as we all know, had a wonderfully successful career there. So he finally writes this pair of string quartets, Opus 51. There are 2 quartets. We are hearing the second of them this afternoon. You will hear a lot of sonorities that are familiar for Brahms. Certainly his harmonic language is consistent with what we know from his other works. It's just he's never completely at home writing just for a small ensemble of strings, and yet it is still great music. My first example is the second theme from the first movement, because to me it shows not the heroic or dramatic side of Brahms, but at his most ineffably tender. It's just the kind of music that makes you think of the tenderness of the beloved lullaby. It's lovely, lovely music and shows him at his melodic greatest. Track 14, please. Music of that kind of loveliness makes me want to weep, not because it's sad, but because...
This quartet for me is outside the shadow of Schumann's plural, both Robert and Clara, because it's just such loving music.
Yes, no question. All right, we don't really have time to go at length into the slow movement, but there's one very important example I wanted to play you from the quasi-minuetto, because he takes a page straight out of Beethoven in this movement and interpolates a fast dance. Sound familiar? We heard something very like that in the Opus 18 quartet. So let's hear this excerpt. By the way, he also switches from triple meter, which you would expect in a minuet, to duple meter for the dance. Track 15, please. He's clearly trying to interpolate some humor into there, but he's also trying to jar us out of our complacency with the idea of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's no courtly dance, and him calling it a minuetto is really a throwback to the 18th century, because almost everybody was writing scherzi by this point.
Yeah. Quasi meaning in the style of, not necessarily the actual minuet.
Yeah, but I think there's a very definite bow to both Beethoven in the idea of throwing it in the middle of an incongruous context, and to Haydn because it's a gesture of humor. Now, the last movement is singular. Gary has already mentioned Joseph Joachim. Even before his collaboration with Joachim, he worked with another important Hungarian violinist, Edward Reményi.
And with Reményi's blessing, I would say, he actually showed, as I understand, some of his early works to him. And I think that the Hungarian flavor would have never happened if it wasn't for the two Hungarians that came into his life, because Brahms is from Hamburg. It's really far north. It's not somewhere you travel to.
Brahms's most celebrated Hungarian-influenced music is, of course, the Hungarian dances, originally for piano four hands, and then later orchestrated, some by him, some by Dvorak, some by others. They became hugely popular. But the finale of the violin concerto by Brahms is also strongly influenced by Hungarian music.
Piano quartet.
The G minor piano quartet finale is All Ungheresi in the Hungarian style. You will hear a lot of the same ploys in this excerpt from the last movement, which is quite typical of what goes on in the last movement, because there are these really strong cross rhythms. There's intensity, there's passion, drama, all things that you would expect from Hungarian music, especially gypsy-inflected music. But what I really want you to notice is try to keep track of where the beat is, where the pulse is, and what meter you're in, and listen to how cleverly he confuses you and then sets you right again. Track 16, please. You reach a point where you're not quite sure which foot to tap with, but at the same time, you're totally caught up in both the melodiousness and the compelling rhythmic fabric of this incredible music. I absolutely love these quartets, even though Brahms struggled with them. I'm so glad he did not destroy his Opus 51. Here. And I know that you are going to enjoy the Atrium Quartet's fine performance this afternoon. Thank you for being with us, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Enjoy the concert.